Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Mi'kmaq-led conservation webinar series. My name is Trish Nash, and I am the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas Manager at the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources. So I'll be facilitating tonight. Tonight's webinar is on Netukulimk in practice, informing science and stewardship. The format tonight is going to be an opening prayer, a presentation, which is going to be about 25 minutes. Then we'll have questions. So please post your questions in the chat. Then we're going to have a draw for a beautiful dream catcher from Membertou. And then we'll have a closing prayer. I'm really honored tonight to introduce Elder Ernest Johnson. Ernest Johnson is a well-respected elder from Eskasoni First Nation. He is a member of the Baha'i faith and a traditional knowledge holder. Ernest and his wife, Minnie, work with the community's youth and adults to keep local Mi'kmaq cultural traditions and traditions of trapping alive, and has a knack for modernizing his work with traditional crafts using modern tools. Ernest is also a member of the DeBert Museum Elders Group, and he is also a professor at Cape Breton University and teaches advanced Mi'kmaq. Ernest has a rich knowledge of the animals and ecosystems of Unama'ki and often provides knowledge and guidance to both UINR and Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission. So welcome, Ernest, and could you help us with an opening prayer?
Hello. Tonight we are facing a lot of pestilence and that compels me to pray for assistance, and that we as the Mi'kmaq people may be able to succeed in our efforts to bring forth a better and a meaningful community. And in our work, we will succeed in every way. So tonight I will ask the Creator, I will send my prayers to the Creator on all our behalf. And the prayer I will be reading is a prayer of unity. Unity in diversity is a great, it has always been the wish of the Mi'kmaq nation and all the indigenous people that mankind unites in every way. I will read this prayer in English. I do know it in Mi'kmaq, but I will say it in English for everybody. Oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants and reveal to them thy great purpose. May they follow thy commandments and abide in thy law. Help them, O God, in their endeavor, and grant them strength to serve thee. O God, leave them not to themselves, but guide their steps by the light of thy knowledge, and cheer their hearts by thy love. Verily, thou art their helper and their Lord, the glory of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernest. Now I'm going to introduce our presenters. Shelley Denny. Shelley Denny is a Mi'kmaq currently residing in Eskasoni. and employed as the Director of Aquatic Research and Stewardship at UINR. Her background is in aquatic biology and fisheries ecology and is currently an interdisciplinary PhD candidate at Dalhousie University with the Marine Affairs Program. Ms. Denny's research focus is using two-eyed seeing to develop an alternative fisheries governance model for Mi'kmaq inherent and treaty fisheries in Nova Scotia. Also with us tonight is Allison McIssac. And Allison is a biologist whose main background is in shellfish aquaculture. She has been working at Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission for close to 25 years and has been involved in research and stewardship focusing on several species within the Brador Lakes and its watershed. So welcome, and I'll turn over the presentation to you, Shelley and Allison.
As introduced, I am Shelley Denny, and today I'll be co-presenting with Allison McIssac from Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission. And today our topic is Netukulimk in practice and informing science and stewardship. Sometimes it's difficult, though, to speak to Netukulimk without providing some context to this Mi'kmaq value and why it's important to what we do and how we approach research. So I'll be discussing two-eyed seeing and the knowledge system approach that underlies the how we do things at UINR and how EFWC also approaches research and stewardship. So with that, we'll be presenting on two-eyed seeing and the knowledge system approach and provide examples of how our organizations are incorporating Netukulimk. So we are a Mi'kmaq people of the East Coast. We are Indigenous. Our diet has mostly been comprised of aquatic species, and traditionally we are self-governing through the Senti Mawiomi, or the Mi'kmaq Grand Council. We're also very proud of our treaties that are with the British Crown and not with Canada. So with two-eyed seeing, Albert Marshall's concept is world-renowned. It refers to the gift of multiplicity. Albert doesn't tell us how to do two-eyed seeing, but he does give us some guidance. Albert tells us that two-eyed seeing is about co-learning. It's about the opportunity to co-produce knowledge using the strengths of Western and Indigenous knowledge and respective ways of knowing. What I've learned is that it's an approach for which collaboration can and should occur when working with Indigenous people, like the Mi'kmaq, or when we need to find solutions to some of the real-world problems facing many of us today. Two-eyed seeing is a process. Collaboration is a process as well, but two-eyed seeing is a particular type of process. It's a collaboration through learning and a way to produce something new. One thing I learned that it's contextual, and one size does not fit every situation. What two-eyed seeing isn't, it's the reliance on only Western or only Indigenous knowledge. It isn't cherry picking or prescriptive or solely gap filling. Fundamental to two-eyed seeing is knowing what knowledge is, whether it is Western knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. And the approach that we bring to two-eyed seeing is based on the knowledge system, not the knowledge itself. Albert also refers this to as ways of knowing. We really need to get down to those ways of knowing to better understand how two-eyed seeing works and why Netukulimk is important when working with the Mi'kmaq. And I prefer to think of knowledge as a verb. It's the how we know rather than what we know. So when we refer to Indigenous knowledge or knowledge systems, we often think of what we know, and it is to some degree. We see this in terms of local ecological knowledge, like where to find the fish or to hunt, and when, and the environmental clues that indicate when such an event is about to occur. But knowledge is a system, whether it's Indigenous or Western, community or institutional. Knowledge system is comprised of many things. What we know, how we practice our knowledge, how we adapt to it, and how we transmit knowledge are the elements most people are familiar with. But the values and the underlying beliefs that are also part of a knowledge system are often ignored. And this is problematic because it's often the values and beliefs that are at odds between cultures, creating a barrier to collaboration and understanding. But this is also the opportunity for two-eyed seeing. There are two challenges in two-eyed seeing process from the beginning. The first is that we don't understand each other's knowledge system. And the second is that we don't understand our own knowledge system. So let's move to examining what Western and Indigenous knowledge systems are. So Western knowledge is referred to as science-based knowledge. It's a systematic verification process to test questions from observations. Western knowledge attempts to produce empirical information that can be repeatedly generated. It consists of the scientific method of hypotheses, development, design, execution, analysis, and interpretation. It's considered to be fully objective and indisputable. So in Canada, the current decision-making model in fisheries and other governments for resource management is segregated and hierarchical, science informs management. So are there values in Western science? And there sure are. Western science values written transmission of knowledge as peer-reviewed publications, conference presentations, and posters. Western science values statistics acquired through quantitative assessments and emphasis on the use of primary publications. And Western science values acquisition of new knowledge to override existing knowledge using the scientific method. And Western science values a certain way of knowing. And above all, Western knowledge values its value-free and objective lens of empirical investigation. Indigenous knowledge is somewhat more complicated, but it's broadly held to be the knowledge of Indigenous peoples. Netukulimk, a Fishwick scholar, examined the typologies of Indigenous knowledge in the literature and identified the strengths and weaknesses of those orientations, as she calls them. These typologies are not mutually exclusive, but rather have different emphasis. As for orientations, the first two in orange, ecological and critical, refer to Western perceptions of Indigenous knowledge. The next two in blue, relational, is how Indigenous people describe the knowledge system, and collaborative is where we strive to be when engaged in cross-cultural collaborations and other governance processes, where two-eyed seeing is the goal. And what I like about Nicole's work is that she brings to the forefront that we may not even be speaking to the same understanding of Indigenous knowledge systems when collaborating. So we'll briefly go through each of the orientations. So ecological orientations of Indigenous knowledge are viewed as a gap filler. It supplements Western science and offers insights into ecological processes. It's recently rediscovered as a form of adaptive management where knowledge could contribute to sustainable management of resources. However, the weaknesses of this orientation is that it's extractive and reduced to observations and practices by resource managers. It neglects the living dimensions of Indigenous knowledge as socio-ecological interdependence and spiritual dimensions, and often ecological orientations are reduced to management rather than governance. This orientation is viewed through the social science lens of power. Here, the orientation of Indigenous knowledge is embedded in uneven colonial relations of power. There are no strengths to this orientation, but it's important that one understands the role of power within and between knowledge systems. This perspective distorts Indigenous knowledge and reduces it to observations, resource management systems, and past and current uses. It also overlooks the belief system, values, cultural significance, social relations, and place-centered identity. Here, written knowledge is valued over experiential or oral knowledge. We often see this expressed as attempts to fit Indigenous knowledge into science, thereby reinforcing the hierarchical structure and power Western society exerts on Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is their relationship with the natural world, and it is lived and is what one does rather than what one knows about. It is distinct and highlighted as different from Western science. It is knowledge that is embedded in cultural frameworks that are rooted in the culture and land and cannot be separated from the roles and responsibilities. Indigenous knowledge systems in particular are driven by ethics as part of the value system. Here, governance is implied. And like other knowledge systems, it expands and contracts in relation to wider social and ecological processes. So it's not easy for anyone to understand Indigenous knowledge, especially those who are grounded in the Western knowledge system. It usually means they know no other way, and it's challenging. Requires Western scientists and resource managers to transcend worldviews and recognize the uniqueness of Indigenous knowledge as a standalone system. It is not universal or pan-Indigenous. It's place-based knowledge that comes from many sources. It requires empowered participation at multiple levels, decision-making, technical, and managerial. So when we consider the Mi'kmaq knowledge system, knowledge transmission is oral, especially through storytelling. The practice is focused on survival and experience and the use of mentoring to transmit knowledge through practice. Knowledge is adapted based on personal experience or experience of the collective. In Mi'kmaq, we have the phrase "Msignogama" that describe our worldview and our primary belief. Literally translated, it means all my relations. It's our relationship with the natural world, the living and the non-living, in the temporal scales of past, present, and future. And this underlying belief is associated with a specific set of values, which we judge what is important and how we develop a standard of behavior. In other words, how we govern ourselves. And this value is Netukulimk, and it describes our relationship with Mother Earth. Netukulimk is our version of sustainability by acting conservatively and respectfully. Self-limitations, preventing waste, sharing, and giving back through ceremony are descriptors of Netukulimk. And you can see that as more than sustainability of natural resources. It's the sustainability of the Mi'kmaq relationship with nature's bounty. And Netukulimk is special, and it applies to all species. It has universal application. It doesn't matter if it's rabbit, oyster, salmon, or lobster, or even research programs. Netukulimk is the expectation for how Mi'kmaq people should behave when interacting in the natural world. So moving back to the other typology of Indigenous knowledge systems, this orientation is the collaborative one. And this is a means of empowerment for Indigenous peoples as opportunities to influence environmental and resource management regimes. So some of its strengths is that it's process-based. It encourages research practices that build self-governing capacity, encourages innovative and transformative processes. It aligns ethics with goals and values, and is an invitation for co-learning and co-production to build adaptive capacity. It does, however, require long-term view and institutional transformation to bring together different ways of knowing, so it can get complicated. But ultimately, this is where we want to be as two-eyed seers. I'd just like to take a break here to see if there are any questions so far. Or if I should keep going.
I think you're good, Shelley. No questions yet.
Okay, so I guess I'll turn it over to Allison then. She'll be providing some of our examples from her organization on how to incorporate Netukulimk in their research projects. Allison, over to you. And I'll be your slide advancer.
Thanks, Shell.
Okay.
Okay, so for the first project that I'm just going to go over is probably one of our older projects that have taken place at EFWC. Back in the early 2000s, the Gasboro Fishers came to the office because they were concerned about the local population. And the way the Gasboro fishery takes place locally is that there are commercial licenses as well as a commercial communal license. And in that commercial communal license, present day, there's 5 fishers who fish under that license, and it gets reported to through the band. And each fisher has a specific area that they fish, so they're very well connected to their fishing locations, and they have a great knowledge of the area, so they know if there's a problem. So the fishers approached EFWC because they were concerned about the population. They noticed that they were catching smaller fish, and they're concerned that the population overall was declining. We set up meetings and kind of looked at what we needed to do from a Western science perspective to answer some of the questions that the fishers had. So ultimately, what we ended up doing was we worked with the fishers to monitor the fishery over a number of years to determine the state of the population and what might need to be done to improve it for the future. We gathered Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge to determine when and how to properly sample the fish. And we looked at Western science methods to collect information about the fish catches. The program involved the Eskazoni Guardians collecting samples as well as the science team. We had 2 separate methods of collecting the information. One was just length data to get overall population size range. And then we also took a subsample back to the lab, and where we processed for more information, such as more biological information, sex, weight, and other things that might help us understand what was happening with the fishery. So that was the two-eyed seeing portion, and it's all interconnected. So I don't think you can really necessarily tease one thing out of the other. But we wanted to show how the project was also guided by Mi'kmaq values. So to be sustainable, we sampled from the fishers rather than using a separate license. This let us have access not just to the fish itself, but to knowledge from the fishers and advice and creating relationships with those fishers. To prevent waste, we offered to give back the fish once it was processed. Oftentimes in this case, that was declined because the fish went on to be sold into the bait market. So in that case, we saved the bait for other projects. We distributed to any partners who might have projects that needed bait. And we also offered it to community members who might be fishing for lobster. In the sharing portion of the values, we, like I said, we exchanged MEK and scientific knowledge through meetings. We met with the Fishers at least once a year to give them an update on what the sampling showed and made recommendations on how the Fishers might, I guess, better manage their activities to protect the stock. And again, as well, the Guardians work close contact with the Fishers to find out when they were sampling or when they were harvesting, and so that make sure that the samples could be collected on time and in a fast manner. And in terms of giving back, it was actually the Fishers who gave back. They ultimately, what was found out was that the population dynamics were changing, and they were catching quite a few fish that had not spawned yet. So they were taking the fish out of the population before they had a chance to contribute to that population. So the Fishers agreed to a volunteer management plan, and this was done to promote spawning of first-year recruits by fishing. And the Fishers agreed to, and still do, only fish 2 weeks out of their 4 weeks season. And over time, this saw a change in the exploitation rate and also an increase in larger fish in their catch. So by taking these measures and working together, we were able to improve the Gasboro fishery. Unfortunately, we were not able to sample last year because of COVID. There was very little activity that happened last year. So the next example I'm going to provide is the oyster. So thanks, Shell. The oyster is a keystone species in the environment. It supports 300 or more species in an oyster bed. These include eelgrass, juvenile, and adult fish, shellfish, worms, other algae, and bacteria. They provide refuge to these species. They are also prey for other organisms. They filter the water to maintain water quality, and their shells help to stabilize the sediment to protect shorelines against erosion. Some oyster sampling, mud sampling that was done on the mainland by Acadia several years ago found oyster shells that were over 1,500 years old, and they were still embedded in the sediment and helping to stabilize that sediment. And so oysters are also good indicators of the health of the ecosystem. The Mi'kmaq have had a relationship with the oyster throughout time. It's actually an important character in the Mi'kmaq legend. A little boy catches a whale, which was told to the Reverend Silas T. Rand in the late 1800s. In addition to be used for food and economic activities, oyster shells are used for smudge bowls for ceremonies, jewelry, crafts, and in the past were made into beads, which were crafted into wampum belts. This was a form of communication between Mi'kmaq groups and other tribes before and during early European contact. Our oyster work stemmed from an interest to understand the water quality of the Bredor Lake and to investigate opportunities into oyster aquaculture. This was started in the 1970s and continues today. As questions arose about the oyster, its interactions with the environment, and the process of growing oysters for market, we gathered a Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge, as well as worked with Western scientists to gain insight, direction, and answer to these questions. Mi'kmaq values guide the projects we work on. And the first step we take is always to gather Mi'kmaq knowledge. And then we look at Western science and see how that can support the investigation into these questions. Western science can be collected through collaboration with other Mi'kmaq communities and organizations, government, academia, and non-government groups. Successful collaborations in general reflect that partners have been respectful to each other and their values and beliefs, committed to a reciprocal relationship where each learns from the other. So really it's a reflection of the outline that Shelley had provided earlier. when we were preparing for this, I was trying to the values and how they have been weaved through our oyster work, and it was very hard to pick one project. So I'm just going to do a general overview and kind of talk about whether it was in aquaculture or as a food fisher or as a commercial fisher, some of the actions that would take place. Oysters were collected for aquaculture, but also by Mi'kmaq harvesters who recognized that they might be in a poor area and they'd be moved around for further grow out, and so that they can be harvested later. And this also improves the water quality in an area and helps to maintain the population by ensuring that there's a variety of different size oysters in a given area. To prevent waste, oysters can be moved to deeper water from the shoreline as people are walking and enjoying nature. But for aquaculture, these oysters can also be just moved into different areas so they have a better chance of survival. And if we're using equipment and we have other fish species or crabs or that type of thing that are in the trays, we always made sure to release them back to the water. And trays and other equipment are made from durable material that can be reused for a very long time. To share, we made sure that any excess oysters were placed on public beds to support the environment, as well as the food, social, and ceremonial, and other fisheries. And we paid tribute to the oyster by working toward the development of oyster reefs in areas that we saw populations declining, oyster sanctuaries, and this was more in relation to the oyster mortalities due to MSX and oyster parasite, but we wanted to protect areas, traditional areas that had healthy populations so that they might help to further populate the lake once the disease had kind of run its course or stabilized. We've also been involved in studying disease and the development of an oyster breeding strategy. And we've been involved in workshops and welcome educational opportunities to connect with youth. So I believe Shelley is now going to talk about some of UINR's work with salmon.
Awesome. So we've been running a rotary screw trap, which is known as a smolt wheel in Middle River for some time now. Because of COVID last year, we were not able to run that wheel. But for the most part, we've been working with salmon for a long time, and especially in this particular life stage, the smolt and juveniles. But we also work with other partners such as Cape Breton University and the Ocean Tracking Network at Dalhousie on a telemetry project. So looking specifically at where do Middle River smolts go. So we've been, because of our partnerships, we've kind of noticed that we do things a bit differently. And some of the things that we incorporate in our research is that we do take what is needed. We often are known to restrict sample size. So if you only need 20 fish, then 20 fish it is. You don't need to take 40 if you can get away with statistically with taking 20 or 30. So the things that we do to prevent waste is that we often put in a maximum mortality limit. With the Ocean Tracking Network project, we set a maximum of 10 smolt. If you hit the 10, the project is over. So when we got to 8, they really reconsidered their methods and their individuals doing the fish surgery to see what the problem was, because they didn't want the project shut down. So it does create an opportunity for people to work harder and better to ensure the survival of salmon. We tend to work with smaller amounts of fish. We were noticing that that sometimes they go under the unconscious too quick, and we can't deal with them really quick and measure them and clip them and do what we need to do. So we work in smaller batches, and that does take times, but we also prioritize the survival so that it works out better for us in the end. We will protect fish from the elements, make sure that they're covered, make sure they can't jump out, make sure they have appropriate oxygenation. And we work in better environmental conditions for the fish. So if we're doing electrofishing, for example, we will not doing it in July or August. We'll wait until the water level gets higher and cooler in September, which goes against sort of the standard protocols for electrofishing. We do try to incorporate sharing in all our projects. And we make an effort to share the morts, those fish that die. And I mean, we try very much to prevent mortality, but we may get like one, maybe two in a season. So we do try to share the mortalities with Mother Earth. But because of the anesthetic, we were noticing that Mother Earth didn't want them, or at least the animals didn't. And it might have been the anesthetic that they were able to detect. So then we decided to give back to the earth itself. So we often start our season with a ceremony and a prayer and a tobacco offering. And we also do that for any mortalities that we have. So now instead of offering the dead smolts to the cormorants or the eagles or the hawks, we will bury them in the woods. And this goes back to something that elders had told us, that, you know, the salmon are in the trees. So a forest burial seemed fitting. And it's back to you, Allison.
Thank you, Shelley. So now I think we're just moving on to some of our stewardship projects and some of the things that we do for this aspect of conservation. Our community members expressed concerns over the salmon population decades ago. Ecological Fish and Wildlife has been engaging in restoration of local brooks in the community for over 20 years. Back in the mid-90s, we installed structures such as wing deflectors and digger logs with the goal of improving the water flow of the river. Humzabuk is the largest river in Eskazoni, and it is our main salmon river. And the salmon run right now is very small. I believe the last time that we took broodstock out of the river, we were only able to get 8 broodstock. But it is still a river where smelt spawn, brook trout utilize, as well as sticklebacks and other fish. Several years ago, UINR studied the habitat to look at, to look at the quality of habitat in the area, and there was no major issues. There was lots of bugs that salmon like to eat and different things like that. But the real problem is the river itself. It is very wide and it's very shallow now, and this is for a number of reasons. More recently, because of the storms that we've been having with the high water flow. So back in 2014, we surveyed those structures again, and we looked at them critically and realized that they weren't really doing what they needed to do for several reasons. The river is 20 meters wide in some spaces, and that is just to have one structure in place on one side of the river just wasn't working. So working with experts from organizations like the Nova Scotia Salmon Association and funding through Adopt a Stream and other funding sources, the Recreational Fisheries Fund, we were able to get funding to install these structures. And the picture is actually showing 2 deflectors. They're made with hardwood trees that are harvested locally and filled with rock from the river. And the majority of this work is done by hand. So since 2014, we've been lucky enough to have a river crew, and these guys spend 2 weeks in the river moving this rock around to make sure that these structures are filled with rock so that they can help improve the river. And their main goal is to create pools and create gravel bars along the side so that it narrows the river, and then it provides better migration upstream. And since 2014, we've also been able to strategically use our resources to make sure that these structures are monitored every year. We have 26 structures along the river right now, and there's a lot more work to be done. But we feel that it's starting to work. We've noticed that in the spring, smelts use these structures to rest as they're moving upstream. We've seen pools have actual trout in them, pools that we haven't seen trout in those pools in years. So we do see an improvement. And we've also started looking at ways that we can better monitor the habitat to make sure to quantify some of these improvements, but also so that we can involve two-eyed seeing more in this particular project. We have people who are very involved with it and have a lot of knowledge, and we are now integrating the two sources of knowledge. And when we look at sustainability and things like that, when we think about taking what is needed in this particular river, it's not possible to take salmon to feed the community. The population does not meet conservation requirements, and it's just too low. So community members are asked to fish elsewhere where the salmon populations are in better health. We prevent waste by avoiding catching salmon. We ask the community members to target trout and other species, and if they're doing catch and release, to use barbless hooks. The sharing component is sharing knowledge from fishers about salmon run timing and threats to salmon habitat and salmon itself. The fishers, we meet with the fishers or in small groups or hopefully a larger group to discuss issues that they see that are happening, and also provide us with information about perhaps things that we should be doing, or timing of sampling and different things like that. And we are able to honor the salmon, especially when we're doing educational outings, when we release fish for Fish Friends. The immersion class was able to come with us, and before we released the fish, they sang the honor song, and then we went down to the river, and each of the students were able to release some trout to the river. We have not released salmon in a while. So yeah, that's kind of a summary of that. And now I'll let Shelley take over again.
Thanks, Allison. So our experiences and practices evolved into organizational policies. As our organizations expanded, it was difficult to ensure that our values were incorporated into research practices. So we incorporated Netukulimk into our research policy for both safety and field work. So we have a policy that says safe procedures for working in the environment are consistent with the Mi'kmaq practice of Netukulimk. In the context of working with and around the environment, Netukulimk as safe environmental procedures are those developed to minimize risk to and unnecessary harm and treatment of the plants, animals, water, and soil. But we did notice that it was also difficult to ensure our partners or collaborators were working with our values. So we recently developed our research tenets. They were just done last year and kind of put out to the public this year. And these are important ways to communicate our values to our partners, and it provides that standard for partnership. So we do base them on two-eyed seeing, so we have a little brochure. But one of the things that we often promote is that number 7, research must have minimal impacts to the environment, including the species studied, community involvement, and the environment as examples. We encourage potential partners to work with us to integrate ways we can minimize harm, yet meet the research criteria to ensure a successful project. So that is one of our standards, is that we must have minimal impact to our natural world. So I guess just as a summary slide, Netukulimk is an important Mi'kmaq value derived from the belief in Imsit Nogama. This is based in the understanding that values and beliefs are fundamental to the Mi'kmaq knowledge system and to two-eyed seeing. And lastly, Netukulimk is not only a concept for sustainable harvesting. There are other applications as well. And in this presentation, we hope that you have seen some of the ways that we use Netukulimk, in particular, how it guides our research and stewardship activities and forms the basis of our research policy, but also informs how we develop partnerships with others. So I say thank you, and Wela'liek.
Great, thank you. Excellent presentation. I learned a lot. I didn't know that oysters could live to 1,500 years old. That's amazing. We do have a question though, and it's from Karen Beasley. And she asks, Indigenous knowledge systems and Mi'kmaq knowledge systems make so much more sense to me than Western knowledge systems, even though I come from the settler society. I love that it explicitly acknowledges the beliefs and values and my ethics along with those beliefs and values, all my relations and Netukulimk. I am often so dismayed and frustrated by colonial, neoliberal, and human-centered beliefs ingrained in Western society, even from my place of privilege. I admire your strength and have gratitude for the guidance and leadership of Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous peoples. Do you have any guidance for how to transform Western beliefs towards all my relations and values towards healing relationships?
Well, I mean, I think that comes through two-eyed seeing. So we need to have those opportunities where we can share our knowledge and understand each other's perspectives. And if you recall, one of the first things that I mentioned is that we often don't understand each other's perspectives, and sometimes we don't understand our own knowledge system. So it's really important that we spend some time reflecting on what our values are when it comes to a knowledge system. How do we value knowledge? How do we value credibility? And what counts as knowledge are really important things to consider when working with other people.
Great. Oh, Allison corrected me. It was the shell that was 1,500 years old, not the oyster. So
Sorry about that.
no, that's okay. That was probably my mistake. Yeah. And Haley also commented, she said, thank you very much for the great presentation. I have a question. So Shelley and Allison, you said that you have the research tenants and you try to educate, I guess, Western scientists about Mi'kmaq values. And how do you think you best do that?
You want to go, Allison, or me? Me?
You go ahead, Joe.
Well, yeah, I mean, the research tenants are there to support that, right? So we always want to be part of the process. So, you know, a lot of the time, people do get funding because of Indigenous partnership. And we want to make sure that, you know, we're in the proper place as partners and not as a logo on the end or anything like that. So we want to be partners. We want to be engaged early, and we want to have that opportunity to be able to guide the research. We usually have some things that we recommend, and that's a steering committee, so that we have that opportunity to guide the research. Other things that we are very particular about is communication. To make sure that we have the proper placement of ourselves and our involvement, and again, don't like to be at the tail end. So we really like to make sure that, you know, the partnership is highlighted in addition to the goal of the project too, right? So that it's more than just the what, it's the how, right? And a lot of people don't really know how to do these partnerships with people. But I think once you start learning how different sometimes it is, then you like, okay, we need to do something. And there's things that you can't even predict that are going to happen. And you're just like, oh dear. One time we had somebody help us with electrofishing and the salmon had died. And normally, like I said, we would bury the salmon, or, you know, the salmon's like not very big. So we bury it. And all of a sudden they said, oh, this one's dead, and flung it in the air. I swear you could hear a pin drop. We're like, oh no, we forgot. And we blamed ourselves because it was us who hadn't informed this individual about how to treat mortalities, right? So we take the responsibility on ourselves to ensure that we educate our partners and our collaborators in our values at the get-go now. So we don't wait until it's over or halfway through. It's something that we do right away. Allison, do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's just important to say that we do that now rather than wait, because I think when we get involved in projects and partnerships, we don't come at it from a perspective where we're just going to put one little toe in and then walk away. Like, we expect to be a full partner unless we're told otherwise. And there's been a lot of times that we have not been reciprocated that way. So when we talk about reciprocal relationships and relationship building, That's really key. Like, we don't typically have a meeting unless someone's fed, and we prefer face-to-face. Obviously, COVID now has changed that, but it's those relationships that we build that kind of lays the foundation for the work. And we recognize that in some cases, you're coming down maybe from Halifax, you have a day, 2 days, there's schedules and things like that, but there's always ways to take that little bit of extra time to make sure that that relationship is built. We don't need hours. We just need to make sure that we are, I guess our perspective of a project is the same as yours. So it's like managing expectations, meeting expectations, I think is kind of the key too, right?
You find that that's getting better?
It depends.
Same.
There's always room for improvement.
The willingness to be, willingness for change, or the willingness to do something a little bit different. And sometimes that quality is not an easy quality to find in others.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Maybe we'll do the draw now, Megan.
Yes, and our winner is H. Cameron. So if you just want to send me a little private message in the chat here, just with your email, and then I will touch base tomorrow, and we'll figure out how we're going to get your beautiful dream catcher to you.
Yeah, it's really nice. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to ask Ernest now if you can share a closing prayer for all of us.
Yes, thank you. It's just here. It's very exciting to. I'd just like to make a comment on tonight's presentation, because it's really great to see something like the Gasboro Hospa and the oysters, the harvest being harvested, and the waste is taken up. Myself personally, for the last few years, I have been involved in trying to rejuvenate or try to bring back the practices of our people, where I think both UINR and EWF have been involved in for us, where there might be some waste, would be waste, like the Gasboro sometimes are not sold, so I get to get them, and they're excellent source of fertilizer for corn and gardens, and we kind of lack in fertilizers. And again, grounded up oysters is also a much needed part of organic gardening, and I think the surgence of people where now they're beginning to be more interested in growing their own foods. So I don't know if there would be room for them. We have enough Gasboro to go around, and the oyster shells, for these people who are who would be looking for the Gasboro as it was once the main source of fertilizer for the indigenous people, especially here in the Maritimes, and that was before the horses and cows and manure and all that. That's all we used. And knowing that, I think that there's a lot of the people who are beginning their gardens, what can I have for fertilizer? And I say, well, gee, you better talk to some people at UINR, because they're involved in fishes. They might have something for you. But I think, I'm glad to see that the waste and everything else is being taken care of. and that we are looking at both science and knowledge just from both sides. And it's really good to see that happening. So it's springtime, and a lot of us will be looking for new things, and like Shelley said, the norts and the small fishes who are going to be making their way upstream, and so that we will have a new growth next year, and that I've noticed that walking up the rivers, sometimes I see things there that weren't there before, and I ask why. I says, well, these are to help the fish or spawning and other things find their way to where they're going. So as an individual, as an elder, and I really appreciate seeing that. And thanks to these two groups, to one group really, who are doing everything to make that happen. So I better set up and magnify, O Lord my God. Be thy name whereby the trees of the garden of thy revelation have been clogged with verdure, and be made to yield the fruits of holiness during the springtime, when the sweet savors of thy favors and blessings have been wafted over all things, and cause them to bring forth whatsoever had been preordained for them in the kingdom of thy irrevocable decree and the heavens of thine immutable purpose. I beseech thee by this very name not to suffer me to be far from the court of thy holiness, or debarred from the exalted sanctuary of thy unity and oneness. Ignite then, O my God, within my breast the fire of thy love, and its flame may burn up all else except my remembrance of thee, that every trace of corrupt desire may be entirely mortified within me, and that not may remain except the glorification of thy transcendent and all glorious being. This is my highest aspiration, my ardent desire, O thou who rulest all things, and in whose hand is the kingdom of the entire creation. Thou verily dost what thou choosest. No God is there besides thee, the Almighty, the all-glorious, the ever-forgiven. Glory of God.
Thank you, Ernest.
Wela'liek Ernest.